Year 11, this is your third lesson for week 12 of the History Revision programme, and as you'll know, this week we're looking at Nazi Germany, but we split Nazi Germany into 3 sections to make it more manageable, and this week we're looking at Nazi Germany Part 1. This week you should already have listened to the knowledge PowerPoint, where basically Ms Monroe's talking through all of the details that you need to know for this section, and for your second lesson you should also have completed some of your own revision materials in your flexible revision lesson. It's really important that you've done those things before you start today's lesson, as we're now going to be moving on to exam technique. So let's get started. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the technique needed for question 6, which hopefully you're familiar with now. Question 6 is always a question which asks you which is the most important, and it will give you 2 factors to discuss. Now, this question is worth 12 marks, and because of that, it should take you around 15 minutes to answer. In terms of answering this question, you need to make sure that you do 3 detailed paragraphs. It's really important that you address both of the factors in the question and that you make a judgment at the end in your conclusion. In these detailed paragraphs, it's really important that you show off your knowledge. The examiners want to see that you are knowledgeable about the factors that they've asked you to discuss, and also make sure that you're linking back to the question within your discussion as well as the knowledge. At the end, when you make your judgment, you have to make it clear which of the factors you think is the most important in addressing a certain issue. It's also important that you make sure your answer is balanced. That means making sure that you do discuss both of the factors kind of equally. That doesn't mean that your paragraphs have to be exactly the same length, but they should feel quite balanced. What you don't want is like 1 or 2 sentences for one and then a whole paragraph about another. It's really important that it feels balanced, and you make sure as well that you're using some facts and figures and just those specific details as part of your answer as well. So that's basically about the technique. Remember, it's 15 minutes that you're answering this question in. It's 3 detailed paragraphs. You've got to have lots of knowledge and you've got to make a judgment at the end as well. So we're going to have a look at an example of this together on the next slide. Okay, so first of all, we're going to be looking now at our first example for question 6. The question is, which of the following was the more important reason why Hitler was able to maintain control of Germany? So remember, guys, that this is basically a question asking you about your control knowledge. So we're not looking at how he became dictator, we're looking at how he held on to that dictatorship. That's why it's asking us about how he maintained control, not how he gained it. So ultimately, when you think about control, you should naturally think of terror, propaganda and popularity, because they're the subheadings you've been looking at when you've been making your notes about control in Nazi Germany. But this question is only asking you about propaganda and the police state. Now, I know that the wording of that is slightly different, but police state is basically referring to terror. A police state is basically where a government exercises its power through a police force, and quite often that will often mean they have a secret police force in place as well, and that is something we did see in Nazi Germany. So basically, guys, you're looking at propaganda and how he essentially used propaganda to help him maintain control of Germany, and then you're also going to look at the police state as a second paragraph. That's where you look at terror, you look at the SS, you look at the Gestapo, even the police and the courts and things like that. Combined together, that is a police state. You've got to talk about how that helped him to maintain control in Germany. And of course, it's really important that you would have a third paragraph as well. Your third paragraph would be your judgment. So that is where you would make it very clear whether you think it was propaganda or the police state that was more important for helping Hitler to maintain control. Now, of course, it's important we understand that these factors worked together, of course, to help Hitler maintain control of Germany. And so you can't really be wrong with your argument here. You can go with propaganda or you can go with police state, but it is really important that you make sure you defend your argument and you back it up with some sort of evidence and explanation. Okay, so let's have a look at this as a model answer before I set you off on a question of your own. Right, so this is the model answer for the question that we've just looked at. So just to remind you of the question, it's which of the following was the more important reason why Hitler was able to maintain control of Germany? Was it propaganda or was it the police state? So as you can see here that there are 3 paragraphs in total, which is what the technique suggests you should have. You have 1 paragraph about propaganda and 1 paragraph about the police state. And obviously in the end, we've got a conclusion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read through this answer with you, and then we'll pick out a few things that I think are really good about this answer and why I think this is a model of what you can go off and do yourself. So let's read through it together. Listen carefully. Propaganda was a vital tool for control. Hitler, through Goebbels, controlled all aspects of the mass media. Art and culture were transformed by the Nazis after 1933. In terms of art, the only art allowed was traditional art, and art that was glorifying the Nazis. No modern art was allowed. Hitler saw abstract and modern art as decadent. Architecture was also impacted, as it could show the strength of the Nazi regime. New buildings were to be built in neoclassical style, and the Nazi eagle was placed on all important buildings. This was a good way of enforcing the Nazi message, as everyone could see these new buildings. It was inescapable. Wider culture was also Nazified. Radio was seen as important because it was cheap and accessible to all. All families could afford the cheap radio sets, and Hitler's speeches were played again and again. Even the streets had loudspeakers installed so that the message could be heard. Nazis also produced many films to promote their views. Themes in films included the virtues of the Nordic and Aryan type, German military and industrial strength, and the evils of the Nazi enemies. Schools were also provided with motion picture projectors because film was regarded as a good way to indoctrinate. Newspapers were censored and only pro-Nazi views were aired. There was no free press. There were also mass rallies. The most famous of these were the Nuremberg rallies from 1923 to 1938. These symbolised solidarity between the German people and the Nazi Party. This point was shown by the yearly growing number of participants, which finally reached over 500,000 from all sections of the party, the army and the state. The police state was a massive part of Hitler maintaining control of Germany. The first element of the police state was the SS. These were Hitler's personal bodyguards, and they essentially became the police force in Nazi Germany, and they hunted down opponents. They numbered 200,000 by 1935. Their powers were far-reaching. They had the power to search and arrest without trial, and they ran the concentration camps. Working alongside the SS and feeding into the climate of fear was the Gestapo. Like the SS, they had extraordinary powers and could use telephone taps and mail interception, and had powers to arrest without trial, to torture, and to send to concentration camps. It was their job to find and deal with enemies of the state. In addition to the Gestapo, there were 160,000 informers who reported anyone who was anti-Nazi. Therefore, fear became a fact of life for ordinary Germans. The concentration camps were also able to control the people. Many very ordinary Germans were sent there for crimes such as grumbling, anti-Nazi graffiti, and other things. They were first used in Germany in 1933, and they became prisons for enemies of the state. For example, political opponents, communists, Jews, gypsies, and those who refused to conform. The judicial system supported this, as the Nazis controlled the courts. From 1934, the People's Court was set up with Nazi judges, and therefore anyone who was anti-Nazi stood no chance of being protected by the law. This would have reduced opposition to the Nazis, as Germans knew that this would be punished. The amount of crimes which resulted in the death penalty increased from 3 to 46. This certainly helped Hitler maintain power. The use of propaganda and the police state was significant in helping Hitler to maintain control of Germany. They worked together to indoctrinate the German population and strike fear into those who did not toe the line. However, I would argue that the police state was the more important reason that Hitler was able to maintain his power. Although the ordinary German people would have been more influenced by propaganda, those who opposed Hitler and the Nazis were silenced by the police state, and anyone who may have disliked any of Hitler's policies were encouraged not to join any opposition groups out of fear of the consequences. This meant that even when opposition existed, it could not become anything large enough to successfully challenge Hitler's control of Germany. So overall, you can see that there are 3 paragraphs there. One thing I would point out is the amount of knowledge. You can see that there are lots of facts and figures being used, for example, dates as well. On top of that, there's just extra detail, lots of examples. For example, in paragraph 1, we're looking at things like art, we're looking at architecture, we're looking at film, we're looking at schools. There's lots and lots of different examples of how propaganda was embedded into German society by the Nazis. But then when we look at the police state, again, we've got lots of examples like the SS. We, of course, look at the Gestapo. We look at the police and the courts and things like that with the Nazi judges. There are lots and lots of different examples. The detail is specific. So it's looking at, we're not just briefly, vaguely stating things, are we? We're using detail to back up what we know about these areas. Now, as I mentioned, the conclusion, you could go with any direction. Now, in the conclusion, I have tried to make it clear, of course, these things work together. And I have also tried to make it clear that, of course, most people would have been more influenced by propaganda, because obviously most German people wouldn't have necessarily have experienced terror firsthand. However, what I've tried to argue is, as many of you might believe the police state was more important, I've tried to suggest why that might be. Some people might believe that the police state was more important because you could say that actually it was almost impossible for people to challenge Hitler's power and to actually create really kind of strong momentum for opposition in Germany. And that meant that he was able to maintain power because nobody could really overthrow him or get rid of him, as there wasn't really that opportunity with the police state in place. So that's an example of a 12 marker. On the next slide, I'm going to be giving you another question for you to have a go on your own. Make sure that you have something like this with you because it can really help you to develop your understanding of what you need to place in your own paragraphs. Okay, so this is the question 6 example 2. This one is for you to do on your own. Now, we are asking as well that you send your answers, please, to your teacher for feedback. That is really, really important for us to understand how well you've understood the work you've been doing this week, but also so we can keep giving you feedback to help you improve, and that just then we've got a bank of evidence of things you've been doing at home on your own. So the question I'm asking you to do on your own is, which of the following was more important Hitler becoming a dictator by 1934? So the last question was about him controlling his power. This one is about him getting the power. So do you think the Enabling Act of 1933 or the Night of the Long Knives in 1934 was more important in helping Hitler to become a dictator? So you're going to have to go back over your knowledge of the Enabling Act. You've got to make sure that for that you are describing what the Enabling Act was, but you've also got to make sure that you talk about how Hitler used the Enabling Act to help him become a dictator. Think about the powers that he kind of gave to himself and how he used that power. The second one, the Night of the Long Knives, again, you've got to give lots and lots of detail about what happened on the Night of the Long Knives, but also make sure that you're explaining how the Night of the Long Knives helped him to become a dictator. Think about eradicating opposition and things like that. Make sure again that you do add some specific details from your notes that you did earlier this week. So remember, you've also got to do paragraph 3 as a conclusion. You will have to make it clear which one of these was the more important. Do you think the Enabling Act or do you think the Night of the Long Knives? It's up to you. It is your opinion. They are both definitely factors that enabled him to become a dictator. But remember to make sure that you're backing up your view and sustaining it with some sort of evidence or explanation as well. So as I've mentioned, guys, you need to make sure that you send your full answer to your teacher by the end of today's lesson. You've now got time. This video is a bit shorter today because I've now given you time to enable yourself to get this 12 marker done by the end of this lesson. You should then send your teacher your answer. You can obviously send it through email, you can send it through Teams, and you also need to make sure that you are back on Teams for the last 5 minutes of the lesson so your teacher can talk to you about this as well. So thank you very much for listening, guys. Of course, you can rewind it if you need to hear anything again, but off you go now. Get onto this 12 marker and make sure you hand it in to your teacher.